I have stood in a great many crowds in my life, and I have forgotten nearly all of them. The faces blur. The reasons blur. A man comes to believe, after enough years, that one square of pavement is much like another, and that whatever brought him out into the cold will look small by the time he gets home and takes off his coat. I believed that too once. I do not believe it anymore. There is a mourning I carry with me the way other men carry an old wound, and I would not give it up for anything, though I cannot fully explain why, and I have stopped trying. I only know that I was there, on the steps of St. Havern's in Vermont, on a gray remembrance morning, and that I saw a young soldier do a thing I have measured every other act of courage against ever since. My name is Tom Ashby. I was not a soldier. I want that understood from the first, because what I am about to tell you is the kind of story that men like to dress up in their own borrowed valor, and I will not do that. I came to Vermont that autumn on business that does not matter, and I stayed an extra day because a clerk at my hotel told me that the remembrance ceremony at the cathedral was a thing a visitor ought to see. He said it the way people say you ought to see the sea or a great painting as a duty pleasantly owed. So I went. I had no debt of my own to grieve. I went, God forgive me, as a tourist. The Cathedral of St. Havern stands at the head of a long stone forecourt in the old quarter of the city, where the streets still run in the crooked lines they ran 400 years ago, and the buildings lean in over you like elders at a christening. The kingdom of Aldermere is not a large country, but it is an old one, and it wears its age with a certain severe pride that you feel before you can name it. The cathedral itself is gray, all gray, a gray so deep it looks wet even in dry weather, and that morning it was in fact wet, for there had been rain in the night and a thin mist still hung in the air, beating on the wool of every coat in the square. By the time I arrived, the forecourt was already full. They had set up barriers of dark iron, polished and cold, to hold the crowd back from the broad, shallow steps that climbed to the great west doors, and behind those barriers the people of the city were packed shoulder to shoulder, hundreds of them, perhaps 1,000, their breath rising in small clouds. There was almost no talking. That was the first thing I noticed, and the thing I have never forgotten. A crowd that size, anywhere else in the world, makes a sound like a river. This one made the sound of a held breath. Children stood with their hands folded. Old men had taken off their hats and held them against their chests, though the cold must have bitten at their bare heads. There was a reverence in that square that I had not been prepared for, and it shamed my casual reasons for being there, and it has gone on shamming them ever since. And on the steps stood the guards. I had seen pictures of them. Everyone has. The King's Foot Guards of Aldermere are one of those sights that a country puts on its postcards, and you think you know them from the postcards, and then you stand before them and you understand that you knew nothing at all. They were drawn up in 2 long files, one to either side of the steps, framing the climb to the doors, and between the files ran a clear stone avenue up which, in time, the great and the honored would pass. The guards wore the deep scarlet tunic of the regiment, the wool so dark and so heavy it seemed to drink the gray light and give nothing back, and tall black caps of bearskin that made each man a head taller than he had any right to be, and white gloves, and at the breast of each the dull gleam of medals on faded ribbon, and at the side of each, held just so, a rifle with a fixed bayonet whose edge the mist had silvered. They did not move. I want to be careful here because every man who has tried to describe these soldiers reaches for that phrase, and it has gone soft from overuse, and I do not want it to go soft now. When I say they did not move, I do not mean that they stood very still, the way you or I might stand still while a photograph is taken, with 1,000 small surrenders rippling through us, a swallow, a shift of weight, a blink. I mean that they had made of stillness a kind of work, a thing performed with the whole body and the whole will, hour upon hour, until it stopped looking like restraint and started looking like the natural condition of a man. Their eyes were forward. Their chins were level. The mist gathered on their lashes and they did not blink it away. A pigeon walked the stone at the boot of the nearest of them, pecking, indifferent, and the man's eyes did not flick toward it. I stood close enough to one of them, just on the other side of the iron, that I could have reached out and touched the scarlet of his sleeve, and I watched him for the better part of a minute, hunting for the human in him, for the proof that he was as cold and as tired and as ordinary as I was, and I found nothing. He was a column. He was a wall. He was the idea of a soldier, made flesh and then made stone again. I tell you all of this so that you will understand what it cost later, when one of them moved. The young one nearest me, and I would not learn his name until afterward, but I will give it to you now so you need not wait for it. For his name was Crane, Sergeant Will Crane, though that morning he was only to me a wall in scarlet. The young one nearest me could not have been more than 25. You could read the age in the line of his jaw, in the smoothness under the strap of his cap. He had the kind of face that has not yet decided whether it will be hard or kind, the face of a man at the hinge of his life. I found, standing there, that I kept coming back to him, that of all the soldiers on those steps he was the one my eye returned to, and I could not have told you why. Perhaps it was only that he was nearest. I have since come to think it was something else, something I had no word for at the time, a sense that of all the still men on that stair, he was the one in whom the stillness was costing the most, the one holding hardest to a thing that wanted out. The ceremony was not due to begin for the better part of an hour, and so the crowd stood and the soldiers stood and the mist came down, and into that long patient hush there came, working its slow way along the front of the barrier, an old man. I noticed him before I understood why I was noticing him. He was small and bent, and he moved the way the very old move when their bodies have become a country they no longer fully govern, each step negotiated, each shift of weight a small private treaty. He had a stick, a plain wooden stick worn pale at the handle by a lifetime of hands, and he leaned on it heavily, and he came along the line of the barrier with his head down, watching the cobbles, because to an old man cobbles are not quaint, they are a danger, every one of them a place to fall. He wore a coat. I want to describe the coat to you carefully, because the coat is where the whole morning began to turn, though none of us knew it yet. It was a soldier's coat, not a costume of one, not a fashion cut to suggest one, but the real article, old as the man himself, of a green so faded by years and weather and washing that it had gone nearly to gray, the gray of everything else in that square, so that at a glance he seemed to be wearing the city itself. It was a coat that had been mended many times and mended honestly, with stitches that did not match, the work of a man's own hands or a wife's, long ago. The brass of its buttons had been polished that morning. I could see that even from where I stood. The buttons caught what little light there was and held it, while everything else about him gave the light back to the gray. He had got up that morning, this old man, whoever he was, and before he left his rooms he had taken a cloth to the buttons of a coat older than most of the people in the crowd, and that small fact, once I understood it, undid something in me that I had thought was past undoing. On his breast, over the heart, he wore a single medal. One. It hung on a ribbon whose colors I could not make out in the gray, washed pale as the coat, and it swung a little against him as he walked, and he had a way of pressing his free hand flat against it, now and then, the way you press a hand to a thing you are afraid of losing, as though the medal might decide to leave him too, the way so much else had clearly left him. He came on slow, along the iron, and I saw that he was making for the steps, not for a place in the crowd, where the rest of us were content to stand and watch, but for the foot of the great stair itself, where the soldiers framed the climb to the doors and where, plainly, no one of the crowd was meant to go. There was a kind of terrible determination in it, in the way this frail old man set his course for the one place in the whole square he was least permitted to be, and held to it, step by negotiated step, with his head down and his hand on his medal, as though he had decided this thing a long time ago and a long way from here, and had carried the decision all the way to this morning, and meant to see it done. I was not the only one watching him now. A woman near me had stopped her quiet talk and was following him with her eyes. A man behind me made a small sound, not quite a word. We watched the old soldier come, and we did not understand what he wanted, and we did not, any of us, do anything, because that is the way of crowds. We wait to be told what a thing means before we will let ourselves feel it. He reached the place where the barrier gave way, near the foot of the steps, where a gap had been left for the passage of the honored. And there, at that gap, where the iron ended and the great stone stair began, he stopped. He lifted his head for the first time since I had begun to watch him, and he looked up the long avenue of scarlet to the gray doors at the top, and his face, in that moment, was the face of a man arriving somewhere he had traveled a very long way to reach. I cannot describe it better than that. It was the face you would make, perhaps, at the door of a house you had grown up in and not seen for 50 years. There was longing in it, and there was pain, and there was something steadier and deeper than either, a kind of settledness, the look of a man who has made his peace and come to keep an appointment. And then he took a step toward the stair. He did not get to take a second. From the shadow of the doorway at the side, where the cathedral's lower offices opened onto the forecourt, a man came out fast, and I knew at once, before he had said a word, exactly what kind of man he was, because every great occasion has one, and every small one too. He was perhaps 40, trim, smooth, in a gray morning coat that had been chosen with great care and great expense to look as though no care had been taken with it at all. He had a folder under his arm and a ribbon of office at his lapel, and the particular brisk walk of a man who has been given a small authority over a large day, and means to feel the whole weight of it in his own hands. I would learn later that his name was Price, and that he was an under-steward of the cathedral's ceremonies, a functionary, a man whose entire morning consisted of the management of edges, the edge of the crowd, the edge of the stair, the edge between those who belonged on the steps and those who did not. He had decided, you understood at a glance, that this was the most important work in the kingdom, and he had decided it because no one had ever told him otherwise. He came down on the old man like weather. "No, no, no," he said, and his voice carried, pitched to carry, the voice of a man who wants the crowd to see him doing his work. "Sir, sir, you can't be here. This area is closed. Back behind the barrier, please." The old man stopped. He turned his head slowly, the way he did everything slowly, and looked at the steward, and I saw him gather himself to speak, and when he spoke his voice was thin and cracked and you had to lean toward it, but it was not weak. There was nothing weak in it. "I've come for the service," the old man said. "I come every year." "Then you'll watch from behind the barrier with everyone else," said Price. He had already half turned, as though the matter were closed, as though the old man were a thing he had moved and need not look at again. "The steps are for the official party. Ticketed guests, sir, by invitation. There's no place for you here. There's no place for you here." I have turned that sentence over in my mind 1,000 times since, and it does not improve with handling. Price did not mean it the way it has come to sound to me. He meant only the small administrative thing, that the old man's name was not on a list, that no card had been issued in his name, that the geometry of the morning had not made room for him. But the words came out larger than he meant them, the way cruel words do, and they hung in the cold air over the bent gray figure, and the crowd around me heard them and went very still, the held breath holding harder. The old man did not move toward the barrier. He stood where he was, his hand pressed flat over the single medal on his breast, and he looked at Price with a patience that was somehow worse to watch than anger would have been. "I was at Aldenmore," he said. I did not know then what Aldenmore was. I have learned since. Every man and woman in that square older than 50 knew it the instant he said it, and I felt the word go through the crowd like cold water, a flinching, a sharp small intake of breath from 100 throats at once. Aldenmore. It is a place in the north of Aldermere, a river crossing in a country of low wet hills, and once, in a winter 40-odd years before that morning, a great many young men of that kingdom died there in a few terrible days holding a bridge they had been ordered to hold, and held, against an enemy that should by every reckoning have swept them off it like leaves. The histories use careful words for what happened at Aldenmore. The people of Aldermere do not need the histories. They keep the name the way you keep the name of a grave. To say I was at Aldenmore, in that city on that morning, was not to make a claim. It was to confess a thing. It was to say I am one of the few who walked off that bridge, and most of my friends did not, and I have carried them for 40 years, and I have come here to set them down for an hour as I do every year, and I would be grateful if you would let me. That is what the old man said in 4 words. I did not understand all of it at the time, but I understood enough to know that something sacred had just been laid on the cold stone between those 2 men, and I waited, as the whole square waited, for the steward to pick it up gently. He did not. "I'm sure you were, sir," said Price, and the worst of it was that he was not even unkind, not in his own mind. He was busy. He was efficient. He had a day to run and a list to honor, and no line on his list for an old man in a mended coat who could prove nothing and produce no card. I'm sure a great many people were, but I have my instructions, and the steps are by invitation, and I'm going to have to ask you to move along now before you hold up the party. And he put out his hand, not roughly. I will grant him that, never roughly, and he laid it on the old man's arm, on the faded green sleeve over the thin old elbow, to turn him, to steer him, to move him along, the way you would move a chair that had been left in a doorway. And the old man, who had crossed a bridge under fire when he was younger than Sergeant Crane, who had buried more friends than the steward had ever made, who had risen that morning and polished the buttons of a dead man's war and walked across a cold city on a stick to keep faith with the ones who could not walk at all, the old man, at the touch of that smooth hand on his arm, seemed to fold. Just slightly, just at the shoulders. The determination that had carried him the length of the barrier went out of him all at once, the way air goes out of a thing, and he became, in an instant, only what the steward had decided he was, an old man in the way. His head went down again. His hand came off the metal and took a fresh grip on his stick. And he began slowly, painfully, with the steward's hand guiding him, to turn back toward the crowd, toward the place where there was no place for him, defeated, and the worst of it, the very worst of it, was that he was not even surprised. You could see that he had expected this. You could see that some part of him had known, the whole long walk across the city, that it would end exactly here, and that he had come anyway because the dead were owed the attempt. I have asked myself since what I would have done if no one else had moved. I would like to tell you that I would have shouted, that I would have climbed the barrier, that I would have made of myself a scene and a nuisance and shamed the steward in front of his crowd. I would like to tell you that. I do not believe it is true. I believe I would have stood there as I was standing there, with the hot, helpless feeling rising in my chest and going nowhere, and I believe I would have watched that old man be folded up and put away, and I believe I would have gone home and taken off my coat and told myself there was nothing I could have done. Crowds are cowards. I was a crowd. That is the shameful truth at the center of this, and it is the reason that what happened next struck me the way it struck me and strikes me still. Because Sergeant Crane moved. I was watching him. I had never stopped watching him through all of it, some animal part of me drawn to the nearest of those scarlet walls, and so I saw the exact instant it began, and I will carry the sight of it to my own grave. It began in the eyes. For the whole of that long encounter the young soldier had stood as the others stood, eyes forward, fixed on some point above and beyond the crowd, the discipline holding, the wall whole. But as the old man said the word Aldenmore, I saw the soldier's eyes move. Just that. A flick downward and to the side toward the old man, against every law his body had been taught, and then back, forward, level, the wall sealing itself over again, so fast that I half thought I had imagined it. But I had not imagined it. And in the seconds after, as the steward laid his hand on the old man's arm and began to turn him away, I watched a war fought and won in the face of a man who was not permitted, by every oath and order that bound him to that stair, to fight it at all. You must understand what his stillness meant. These men do not move. They are not allowed to move. It is not a guideline. It is the whole of what they are. A guardsman who breaks his post without command does not merely embarrass himself. He breaks faith with 2 centuries of men who held theirs, with the dead of Aldenmore and 100 fields like it, with the very idea of the unbreakable line that the kingdom puts on its postcards and teaches to its children. To leave his post, in that moment, in front of the king and the court and 1,000 of his countrymen, was to throw away everything he had spent his short, hard life becoming. He knew it. You could see that he knew it. And you could see, in the working of that young jaw, in the white of the knuckles inside the white glove on his rifle, the price of it being weighed, in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, faster and more honestly than I have ever weighed anything in my life. And then he set down the price and paid it. He came off his post. He did not lunge. He did not shout. Whatever else broke in him, his bearing did not break for an instant, and that, I have come to think, is the heart of the whole thing, that he disobeyed the way only a truly disciplined man can disobey, with a precision that turned the disobedience itself into a kind of ceremony. He executed a turn, crisp as glass, the heel of his boot striking the stone with a crack that went out over the silent square like a shot. He took 1 pace, 2, down off his place in the line and onto the open avenue of stone where no one stood, and the whole crowd, the whole 1,000 of us, made a single sound, a low collective gasp, the sound a sea makes when it draws back before a wave. The steward heard it and looked up. The old man, half turned, his head down, did not. Sergeant Crane marched, 3 paces, 4, straight and measured, down the avenue toward the gap in the barrier where the steward stood with his hand still on the old soldier's arm. The bayonet caught the gray light. The bearskin made him enormous. And the steward, Price, watching this scarlet apparition bear down on him out of the line that was never, ever supposed to move, did the only thing a small man can do in the presence of something he does not understand. He let go of the old man's arm and he stepped back, and his smooth, busy authority fell off him like a dropped coat, and he was suddenly only a frightened functionary in a gray suit, his folder clutched to his chest, his mouth open on a protest that never came. Crane stopped. He brought his boots together with a second crack. He was perhaps a pace from the old man, towering over him, scarlet and black against the gray, and for a moment that seemed to last a very long time the two of them stood like that, the immense young soldier and the small bent ancient one, and no one in all that square so much as breathed. The old man lifted his head. I think he believed in that instant that he was about to be removed by a harder hand than the steward's. I saw it in his face, a flinch, a bracing, the patient readiness of a man long accustomed to being moved along. He looked up at the great scarlet figure that had come down out of the line, and he set his jaw, and he prepared with what dignity he had left to be taken away. And Sergeant Crane brought his rifle to the present. If you have never seen it done, I cannot fully make you feel it, but I will try. The present arms is the highest salute a soldier under arms can render, the salute reserved for sovereigns and for the dead, a thing of brutal grace, the whole weight of the rifle swung up and out and held vertical before the face in a single hard exact motion that ends with a stamp of the boot like a hammer on an anvil. It is not a gesture. It is a sentence spoken with the body, and the sentence is, I honor you above myself. And Sergeant Crane, who had thrown away his post and his oath and his good name to cross 4 paces of stone, snapped his old rifle up to the present before that small bent man in the mended coat and stamped his boot on the cathedral steps, and the sound of it went off across the forecourt like a cannon in the silence, and he held it, eyes forward, chin level, bayonet bright, rendering to a turned-away old soldier in a faded green coat the salute his kingdom keeps for its kings. The square broke its silence then, but not into noise. It broke into something stranger and finer, a sound made of 1,000 small sounds, of caught breath and stifled cries, and here and there a sob no longer held, the sound of a great many people understanding the same thing in the same instant and being undone by it together. The old man stared up at the soldier who was honoring him. His mouth worked. And then his face, that patient, ruined, ancient face, simply came apart, the way the coat had been about to, all its long-held composure giving way at once, and the tears ran down into the deep gray creases of it, and he lifted his free hand, the one that had pressed so often over his metal, and he raised it slowly, terribly, the gnarled fingers shaking, and he returned the salute. An old man's salute, crooked, the elbow not quite right, a salute his body had not made in 40 years and had never once forgotten how to make. He stood as straight as the years would let him stand, on his stick, in his dead friend's war, and he returned the soldier's salute. And for one moment the two of them were not old and young, were not bent and tall, were not a discarded man and a sworn one, but were simply two soldiers of the same kingdom, across 40 years and one cold morning, keeping faith with each other and with the bridge and with all the men who never came home from it. And then the line moved. I had forgotten the others. In the great gravity of what Crane had done, I had forgotten that he was one of two long files of men who had not, who would not, who could not move. And so when the second crack came, I did not understand it. And when the third and the fourth came rolling down the steps after it, I think I cried out. I'm not ashamed to say it. I think a sound came out of me. For all down the line, one after another, the guardsmen of the King's Foot Guards were coming to the present. Not on any command. There was no officer who would have dared give it, no officer who could have given it without making himself part of a mutiny, but on the only authority that could possibly have moved them, which was the example of one of their own, who had judged that the moment required it, and had paid for the judgment with everything he had. The man beside Crane brought his rifle up. Then the next and the next, the salute running down both files of the great stair in a ripple of scarlet and steel, each crack of each boot striking the stone a beat behind the last, a long rolling roll of thunder built out of the discipline of 40 men deciding, each in his own 3 seconds, that an old soldier of Aldenmore would not be turned away from the steps of St. Haverns while there was a King's Guardsman left standing to honor him. The whole line, to a man. Holding the present, every bayonet to the gray sky, every eye forward, every boot stamped, for one ancient weeping veteran in a coat the color of the city. I have heard men try to describe great music, the kind that lifts the hair on your arms and makes a fool of your composure, and I have always thought they were exaggerating, the way men do. I do not think so anymore, because there was no music on those steps. There was no sound at all but the crack of the boots and the weeping of the crowd, and it was the most overwhelming thing I have ever stood inside of, and I will tell you plainly that I wept, a grown man, a stranger, a tourist with no debt of his own. I stood at that iron barrier and wept like a child, and so did the man behind me, and the woman beside me, and very nearly everyone in that square. While 2 long lines of the hardest disciplined men in the kingdom, honored an old man, their own kingdom had nearly swept into the gutter. The steward Price had backed all the way against the cathedral wall. He stood there with his folder against his chest, white in the face, looking from the saluting line to the weeping old man and back again, and you could watch the understanding come into him, slow and cold, of what he had done and what was being done to undo it. He was a small man, and he had committed a small cruelty, the kind that gets committed 10,000 times a day in the world and never answered for, the kind we all commit, the brisk dismissal of someone it is inconvenient to honor. And the kingdom's own guard had risen as one to answer it, in front of the whole city, and there was nothing he could do, no list he could consult, no instruction he could cite that would put the morning back the way it had been. He did not try. To his credit, when he had understood, he did the one decent thing left to him. He came off the wall, and he walked to the old man, and he bent, and he said something I could not hear, and then he too, Price, the steward, the small, busy, cruel functionary, Price straightened up and brought his own hand to his brow in a salute, civilian and awkward and unpracticed, and held it. I do not say it redeemed him. I say only that the morning had grown large enough to gather even him into it, and that he led it, and that this was more than I would have expected of him, or of myself. And then there was movement at the top of the stair, at the great west doors, and the crowd's attention swung upward, and I looked up with the rest, and I saw that the doors had opened, and that the official party had come out onto the top of the steps to see what had broken the silence of the morning. The dignitaries, the clergy of St. Haverns in their gray and white, the officers of the regiment with their breasts full of ribbon. And among them, foremost among them, a tall, spare old man, plainly dressed for all the splendor around him, who needed no introduction and received none, for I understood at once, from the way the whole party arranged itself around him like iron filings around a lodestone, that this was the king. I will not pretend to know what a king feels. I know only what I saw. I saw him stand at the top of the steps of his own cathedral and look down the long avenue of his own guard, every man of them holding the present arms in flagrant defiance of every order that governed them, holding it for a weeping old soldier in a mended coat at the foot of the stair. I saw him take it in. And I saw him understand it, faster, I think, than the steward had, faster than I had, for he was a soldier too, that king in his youth, as the kings of Aldermere have always been. And he knew Aldenmore not from the postcards but from the regimental rolls, and he knew, looking down, exactly what his men were doing and exactly why, and exactly what it would cost them under the letter of the law that he himself embodied. He could have ended it with a word. He could have had Crane on a charge before the bells rang noon, and the whole line after him, and no court in the kingdom would have said he was wrong to do it, for they had broken their oaths in the sight of God and the crown. The whole weight of 200 years of unbroken discipline rested on the side of punishment. I felt the crowd feel it. I felt us all hold our breath again, that single thousand-throated breath, waiting to see whether the kingdom would punish its guard for the only beautiful thing any of us had ever seen them do. The king came down the steps. He came down alone, leaving his party at the doors, down the long avenue of his saluting men, an old tall man descending slowly between two walls of scarlet, and the only sound was his own footsteps on the stone. He passed Crane. He did not look at Crane. I do not think he trusted himself to look at Crane, and I do not blame him. He came down to the foot of the stair, to the gap in the barrier, to the small bent figure that stood there with its crooked salute still trembling at its brow, and he stopped before the old man of Aldenmore. And for a moment the king of Aldermere and the last rifleman of a forgotten bridge stood facing each other in the gray, with the whole kingdom watching and the whole guard at the present around them. And the king saluted him. There was no command for that either. There was no precedent for it, no protocol, no line in any steward's folder. The king of Aldermere brought his own hand to his own brow and rendered, to a turned-away old man in a coat the color of the city, the salute of one soldier to another, and held it. And then, and this is the part that finished us all, this is the part that I cannot tell even now without my voice doing something I would rather it did not do. The king took the old man's free hand in both of his, the gnarled shaking hand that had just returned a guardsman's salute, and he held it, and he bent his head. The king bent his head to the old soldier of Aldenmore, and said something to him, low, that no one else could hear. That was his alone and the old man's alone, and is there still. And the old man nodded, weeping, nodding, his whole frail body shaking with it. And the king straightened and turned, and with the old man's hand still held in the crook of his arm, walked him slowly, at the old man's own broken pace. With the whole crowd dissolved and the whole guard at the present and the bells of St. Havern's just then beginning to ring out over the city, walked him up the long avenue of scarlet, up the great gray steps between the saluting men, to the place of honor at the top, where there had been, the steward had said, no place for him. There was a place for him. I do not remember much of the service that followed. I have tried. It is gone, drowned, the way the lesser parts of any great day are drowned by the part that mattered. I remember the bells. I remember that the old man sat at the top of the steps among the dignitaries and the clergy and the officers of the regiment, a small gray figure in a sea of grandeur, and that he did not look out of place there, not any more, because the morning had made him the most important man in the kingdom, and everyone in the square knew it. I remember that the guardsmen, when the king had passed, came down from the present and back to the order, each in his time, sealing the line whole again, and that they stood for the rest of that long service as still and as cold and as immovable as if nothing had happened, as if the stone had never moved at all, and that this, too, undid me a little. The way they put the wall back up, the discipline closing over the wound of the moment like water over a stone, leaving no mark, asking no credit. The great public secret of it kept among themselves. I learned the names afterward from the next day's papers, which were full of it, as you may imagine. The old man was Albert Hollies. He had been a rifleman of the line at the crossing at Aldenmore, one of a company of 200 and some that had held the North Bridge for 3 days in the winter, and one of the 40 who had walked off it. And he had come, every year for 40 years, to the remembrance at St. Havern's, to stand in the crowd behind the barrier, where there was room, and to grieve his friends in private among strangers. And he had never once tried to go up the steps until that year, when something old age, perhaps the sense of an account coming due, had moved him to try to get nearer to them, the dead, one last time. He was 91. He died the following spring in his sleep in his rooms, and the papers said the regiment sent an honor party to his funeral, the whole of the line that had saluted him, and that the king sent flowers, and that they buried him with full honors under a stone that names the bridge. And the soldier was Sergeant Will Crane. The papers worried at the question of him for days. What would be done, whether he would be charged, whether the kingdom would punish the man who had broken the line. The regiment said nothing, in the way the regiment says nothing, but the answer came in time, and it was the only answer that morning could have borne. Nothing was done to Sergeant Crane, except that within the year he was made an instructor of recruits, set over the young men coming into the regiment, given the task of teaching them what a king's guardsman is. I have thought about that a great deal. I have thought that a kingdom which understood itself could have done nothing else, that having seen what the man's judgment was worth, you would not punish it, you would multiply it, you would set him in front of the next generation and say, "Become this." And I have thought, too, about the thing the papers dug up and could not quite explain. The small fact that came out in the days after, that gave the whole morning its last turn and its true bottom, which is this. Sergeant Will Crane had a grandfather. His grandfather was a corporal of the line, a young man of 23, who went north in the winter to a low, wet country and held a bridge over a river he had never seen before and would never see again, and did not walk off it. He was one of the company at Aldenmore. He was one of the ones who stayed. Albert Hollies, the rifleman, the old man in the mended coat, had been at his side on that bridge, a boy of 19 beside a corporal of 23, and had survived the place where the corporal died, and had carried him, carried all of them, every year for 40 years to the steps of St. Havern's, where there was no place for him. I do not know whether Sergeant Crane knew, in the 3 seconds it took him to throw away everything he was, that the old man before him had stood beside his own grandfather on that bridge. I have wondered about it more than almost anything. The papers said the families had never met, that the connection came out only afterward in the searching of the rolls, which would mean the soldier broke his post for a stranger, for the word Aldenmore and nothing more, and there is a kind of glory in that, the purest kind, the man who honors the principle and not the person. But I have always half believed the other thing, the thing no record could prove, that some knowledge older than the rolls passed between those two men in that moment, that the grandson knew his own blood when it stood before him in a faded green coat, that the bridge reached across 40 years in one cold morning and made of them, for the length of a salute, what they had always been, a corporal and a rifleman, keeping faith on the bridge in the winter, where no one was turned away. I came to Vermont as a tourist. I have told you that, and I have not softened it because it is the whole point. I came to see a spectacle, and I saw, instead, the thing the spectacle was built to point at and had nearly forgotten how to point at, that all the discipline of all those still cold men on all those gray steps, the stillness made into work, the human ground down into stone, the wall that never moves, exists for one reason only, and it is not to be admired on a postcard. It exists so that on the one morning in 10,000 when honor itself comes walking up the line in a mended coat, bent and turned away and 91 years old, there will be a man standing there with the discipline to know it, and the deeper discipline, the rarer and the higher one, to break. I have measured every brave act against that morning ever since, and most of them have come up short, including all of mine. I do not mind. A man should have one thing he cannot live up to. Mine is a young soldier coming off his post into the gray, 4 paces of cold stone, to render to a forgotten old rifleman the salute a kingdom keeps for its kings, and the whole line to a man, rising to do it with him. They tell me the regiment does not speak of it, that the young men Sergeant Crane trains are taught their stillness and their silence, and never once told the story of the morning their teacher broke both. I believe it. I think that is exactly right. Some things you do not teach with words. You teach them by becoming the kind of man who will know the moment when it comes, and will not be standing on protocol when it does. The old man knew. The king knew. And on a gray remembrance morning on the steps of St. Haverns, before the whole silent city, a young soldier in scarlet knew it too, and moved, and showed the rest of us, who could not move, what we had been standing there our whole lives waiting to see. I have never forgotten it. I never will. And whenever I hear it said, as it is so often said, that the highest thing in a man is the discipline to stand fast and never break, I think of Will Crane coming off his post into the gray, and I know that this is only half the truth, and the lesser half. The whole of it, the part they cannot put on a postcard, is this. The discipline to stand fast is a great thing, and a hard thing, and most men never learn it. But the discipline to stand fast for years, and then to know in 3 seconds, with everything you are on the scale, the single moment that honor requires you to break, and to break cleanly and pay the price and ask for nothing, that is the whole of it. That is what the wall is for. That is what they were guarding, all of them, all along. Not the doors, not the king. The moment. The old man in the mended coat coming up the line, whom the world would turn away and whom a true soldier never will.